Let me tell you something about the smell of a new manager's office. It's always the same. A sterile mix of cheap leather, lemon-scented cleaner, and the faint, desperate aroma of a man trying way too hard. Ralph's office was a perfect example. The chair he sat in was a monstrosity of black pleather, so new it still squeaked when he breathed. His desk was a vast, empty expanse of dark-stained particle board, a mahogany-colored desert with a single laptop and a motivational paperweight as its only occupants. The paperweight said, "Lead, follow, or get out of the way." It was a phrase so profoundly stupid, so utterly devoid of nuance that it could only have been chosen by a man like Ralph. "I'm Wade." Or I was Wade, shift supervisor at Precision Dynamics, a man who had given 25 years of his life to that plant. I was 52 years old, with hands that knew the feel of steel better than the feel of a keyboard, and I was sitting across that stupid desk from a man half my age with a brand new MBA and an ego that could barely fit in the room with the three of us. He smiled. A tight, bloodless thing that didn't touch his eyes. Ralph had the kind of eyes that looked at people and saw numbers, assets, and liabilities on a spreadsheet he kept in his head. He was looking at me, and I knew exactly which column I was in. He said, "Wade, we appreciate your years of service." That's how these conversations always start. It's the corporate equivalent of telling a man you're about to shoot that he's got a nice shirt on. I just sat there. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my back straight. I'd learned a long time ago on the factory floor that the man who moves first, who flinches, who shows his anger, is the man who loses. I was going to make him do the work. I was going to make him say it. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet, climate-controlled office. "We're moving in a new direction," he continued, his voice oozing a kind of practiced, insincere sympathy he probably learned in a seminar. "We're streamlining operations, optimizing our human capital, synergizing our forward-facing assets." He was throwing a salad of corporate buzzwords at me, hoping I'd be too confused or intimidated to understand what was really happening. I didn't react. I just watched him, my expression as flat and unreadable as a piece of sheet metal. I could see a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He wasn't used to this. He was used to people pleading or getting angry or breaking down. My silence was a wrench in his well-oiled machine. "The truth is, Wade," he finally said, leaning forward and lowering his voice as if he were sharing a secret, "your role has become redundant." Redundant. That was the word. 25 years of showing up before dawn, of working through holidays, of training new guys, of catching mistakes that would have cost the company millions. 25 years of knowing every gear, every circuit, every quirk of every machine on that floor. 25 years of my life, my sweat, my knowledge, all bundled up and dismissed with a single sterile word, redundant. But we both knew that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was the whispers, the conversations in the break room and behind the humming CNC machines, the talk about safety concerns being ignored, about the new impossible quotas that were running men and machines into the ground, the talk about how the company was posting record profits while our wages hadn't budged in 5 years, the talk about forming a union. I wasn't a loudmouth about it. I was careful. I spoke to a few trusted men, guys I'd known for decades, but in a place filled with the low hum of anxiety, whispers travel fast. And someone had whispered in Ralph's ear. He must have seen something in my face then, some flicker of understanding, because his own expression hardened. The fake sympathy evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He leaned back in his squeaking throne, a petty king surveying his tiny, miserable kingdom. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "This plant has a certain way of doing things. It's a well-oiled machine. It doesn't need distractions. It doesn't need troublemakers trying to jam a stick in the gears." He never said the word union. He didn't have to. It hung in the air between us, thick and heavy like the smell of ozone after a short circuit. He was firing me for organizing, a blatantly illegal act. And he was doing it with a smirk on his face, confident that I was just one man, a broken-down old mechanic he could sweep aside like so much industrial dust. He thought he was making an example of me. He thought the other guys would see me, the veteran, the supervisor, cast out, and they would be scared back into silence. That was his first mistake. I looked at him, at his clean, uncalloused hands, at his perfectly pressed shirt, at the smug satisfaction radiating off him. I felt a cold, quiet calm settle over me. It was the same calm I felt when a multi-ton press went into emergency shutdown and everyone else was panicking. It was the calm of knowing exactly what needed to be done. "I understand," I said. My voice was even quiet. The response threw him. I could see it. He had a script for this, a flow chart for how the terminated employee was supposed to react. My calm acceptance wasn't on it. He blinked. "Good," he said, a little too quickly. "Well, good. HR will process your final check. Security will escort you from the premises." Of course they will, I thought. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. He extended a hand across the desk, a final insulting gesture of professional courtesy. I looked at his hand, then back at his face, and I just stood up and turned my back on him. I walked to the door without a word, leaving his hand hanging there in the empty, sterile air. That was his second mistake. He thought the game was over. He had no idea I was about to change all the rules. The walk of shame, that's what they call it. The slow procession past the faces of your coworkers, a burly security guard at your elbow, a cardboard box with your life's trinkets in your arms. But Ralph had even managed to screw that up. He was so eager to get me out, to make a show of it, that the HR drone was still fumbling with paperwork. The security guard, a kid named Marcus who I'd helped get out of a jam with his car last winter, was apologetic. He just stood by the door while I packed my personal effects from my small, cluttered office just off the main floor. My box wasn't full of much: a picture of my wife Sarah and our son Jake, a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Supervisor," a few well-worn technical manuals that the company was too cheap to replace, and my toolbox. It was an old Kennedy, the brown, wrinkle-finish kind. My father gave it to me when I got my first apprenticeship. It was more a part of me than an object. Tucked inside my worn leather lunchbox, beneath a thermos and a Tupperware container, was a small, black, spiral-bound notebook, my log. Marcus, the security guard, cleared his throat. "Ready, Wade?" I nodded. I took one last look around the office that had been my second home for a quarter of a century. I could hear the familiar roar and clang of the factory floor through the walls, a mechanical heartbeat that had been the soundtrack to my adult life. For a moment, a wave of profound loss washed over me. Then I looked at the box in my arms, at that notebook hidden in the lunchbox, and the loss was replaced by something else. Something cold and hard and heavy. Resolve. They didn't make an example of me. They made me a martyr. And martyrs, unlike redundant employees, have a funny way of starting revolutions. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets of my town, the houses and shops I'd seen 1,000 times, looked alien, like a movie set I'd stumbled onto by mistake. I didn't go straight home. I couldn't. I couldn't face Sarah, not yet. Not until I had processed the sheer tectonic shift that had just occurred in my life. I found myself driving out to the old quarry west of town, a place I hadn't been to in years, a place where teenagers went to drink cheap beer and make bad decisions. I pulled the truck over at the scenic lookout, killed the engine, and just sat there staring out at the great gaping wound in the earth. It felt appropriate. The silence in the truck was deafening. For 25 years, my life had been governed by the clock, by the shriek of the shift change whistle. Now, there was just nothing. An endless, terrifying expanse of empty time stretched out before me. The adrenaline of the confrontation in Ralph's office had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching cold. He'd called me redundant. The word echoed in the quiet cab. Redundant, obsolete, a part no longer needed for the machine. He hadn't just taken my job. He had taken a piece of my identity. Who was I, if not Wade, the supervisor from Precision? Who was I, if not the guy who could diagnose a problem with a 50-ton hydraulic press just by the sound it was making? The man who knew that Maria in packaging needed the third Tuesday of the month off for her son's doctor appointments, And that old Sully in maintenance secretly loved country music and would work twice as hard if you let him play it on his radio. All that knowledge, all that experience, all that humanity, it meant nothing to a man like Ralph. To him, we were all just entries on a balance sheet, human capital. And he had decided to divest. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the driver's side window. The full weight of his betrayal pressed down on me, and for the first time that day I felt the foundations of my composure begin to crack. It wasn't just the injustice of it, it was the casual cruelty, the smug satisfaction on his face. He had enjoyed it. He had enjoyed taking my livelihood, my dignity, and casting me aside like a used-up rag. I thought about the men I'd been talking to. Frank, the welder with another kid on the way. Danny, the young hothead on the line, saving up for a down payment on a house. I had put this idea in their heads, the idea that we could stand together, that we deserved better. And now I was gone. The head of the snake cut off. What would they think now? They'd think I was a fool. They'd be terrified. Ralph would get exactly what he wanted, a cowed, silent workforce. The thought was a bitter pill, a poison that spread through my veins. Eventually, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and red. I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to go home. I had to tell Sarah. I started the truck, the familiar rumble of the engine, a small comfort in a world that had suddenly become unstable and strange. Walking through my own front door felt like an act of trespass. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming along to the radio as she prepped dinner. The smell of roasting chicken, a smell that usually meant comfort and home, just made my stomach clench. She turned when she heard the door close, a smile on her face that faltered the second she saw mine. She knew immediately. A good marriage is a kind of silent language, and after 30 years, Sarah could read me like one of my own technical manuals. She didn't ask what happened. She just came over, wrapped her arms around my waist, and held me. I buried my face in her shoulder, the scent of her hair, the solid warmth of her, the only things that felt real in that moment. I didn't have to say a word. She just held me while the tremors of the day's earthquake finally shook their way through me. "Wade, what is it?" It was my son Jake. He was 17, all gangly limbs and teenage certainty, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He had his phone in his hand as always, but he was looking at me with a confused, worried expression. I straightened up, pulling away from Sarah but keeping a hand on her arm. "I'm okay," I said, my voice rough. Jake's eyes darted from my face to the clock on the wall. "You're home early," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, a disruption in the predictable rhythm of his universe. His father was always home at 6:15, smelling of grease and metal. It was 4:30. I took a deep breath. Ralph let me go. The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. Jake's face went blank with a kind of disbelief that only a kid who has never been fired can have. "What do you mean, he let you go? Like fired? Why?" The why was the hard part. How do you explain the complex, ugly politics of the workplace to a 17-year-old who thinks the world runs on a clear set of rules? I tried. I told him about the new quotas, the safety issues. I told him about the quiet talks, the idea of a union. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to a kind of disappointed frown. "So you got fired for talking?" he asked. "Why didn't you fight back?" In his black and white world, you didn't just let someone push you around, you pushed back harder. He saw my quiet exit, my lack of a shouting match, as weakness, as surrender. "It's not that simple, Jake," I started. But he was already shaking his head, a look of judgment on his face that stung more than anything Ralph had said. He mumbled something about having homework and disappeared back into his room. The quiet disapproval of your own son is a unique kind of hell. He saw a man who had been defeated, and in that moment I felt like one. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself in the garage. This was my sanctuary, the smell of oil, gasoline, and old wood. My project was a 1978 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, a beautiful, cantankerous beast that I was rebuilding from the frame up. It was a puzzle of steel and chrome, a thing of pure, honest mechanics. There was no corporate jargon here. A part either worked or it didn't. There was no synergy, just torque specs and timing. I ran a hand over the cool metal of the fuel tank. I had spent so many years being the loyal company man. I remembered old Mr. Henderson, the man who founded Precision Dynamics. He started it in his own garage, not unlike this one. He knew every employee by name. He'd walk the floor every single day asking about your kids, remembering your wife's name. He'd fight with a supplier for a week over a tenth of a cent price increase if he thought their quality was slipping. He believed that if you took care of your people and you made a good product, the profits would take care of themselves. And they did. We were like a family back then. But Mr. Henderson got old. He retired, and his kids had no interest in the business. They sold out to a private equity firm from Chicago, a faceless conglomerate called Northwood Capital, and that's when everything started to change. The first thing they did was cut the annual company picnic, a small thing, but it was a symbol. Then came the new management, a rotating cast of young men with sharp suits and soft hands, each one trying to make his mark by squeezing a little more blood from the stone. Ralph was just the latest and the worst of them. He saw the institutional knowledge of men like me and Sully not as an asset, but as a threat to his authority. He'd come down to the floor, pointing at schematics he clearly didn't understand, making suggestions that were not just inefficient but dangerous. I remembered the day he decided to switch our supplier for the main press bearings. Our old supplier was a German company, expensive but flawless. Ralph found a cheaper option from overseas. Sully, our head of maintenance, a man who could rebuild a gearbox with his eyes closed, came to me, his face pale. He showed me the specs. The tensile strength was lower, the heat tolerance borderline. He told me, "Wade, these things are going to fail. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And when they do, someone's going to lose an arm." We went to Ralph together. We laid it all out, the data, the risks. Ralph just stared at his tablet. He looked up at us. His eyes glazed over with the arrogance of a man who trusts his spreadsheets more than the two men with a combined 70 years of experience standing in front of him. He said, and I'll never forget the words, "The operational cost per unit metric doesn't support a premium component expenditure at this time. We'll revisit in Q4. He was willing to risk a man's limb to make his quarterly numbers look a little better. That was the moment I knew. That was the moment the quiet unease in the plant curdled into real fear. That was when I started the notebook. Not as a weapon, not then, but as a record, as a defense. I documented everything. The date we warned him about the bearings, his exact response, the invoice number for the cheap replacements, every safety meeting he canceled to keep the line running, every experienced worker he laid off and replaced with a temp. I was just covering my own team. I was just being a good supervisor. I never imagined I'd be using it like this. My son's disappointed face flashed in my mind. Why didn't you fight back? Maybe he was right. I had been fighting, but in the wrong way. I was trying to patch the cracks in a foundation that was rotten to the core. I had been too loyal for too long to a company that no longer existed. My loyalty was to the memory of Mr. Henderson, to the idea of what Precision Dynamics used to be. But that company was dead, and a man like Ralph was dancing on its grave. A wave of anger, pure and clean and hot, finally burned through the cold fog of my despair. It wasn't the wild, flailing anger of a man who'd lost control. It was the focused, channeling anger of a man who'd just found it. Jake was wrong. I wasn't defeated, I was just getting started. My phone, sitting on the workbench, buzzed, a number I didn't recognize, probably a telemarketer. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick it up. My thumb hovered over the screen. Then I answered. "Wade?" A woman's voice, crisp, professional. "Is this Wade Miller?" "Yes," I said. "Who is this?" "My name is Maria Flores. I'm a national organizer with the International Association of Machinists. A young man from your plant, a Danny Rourke, gave me your number. He called me about an hour ago. He told me what happened." Danny, the young hothead. I'd given him a card for the union a few weeks back, told him to hold on to it just in case. I never thought he'd actually use it. I'm sorry for what happened to you, Wade, she said. I've seen it 100 times, but I need you to listen to me very carefully. What Ralph did today, firing you for protected organizing activity, wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. And in his arrogance, he handed us the single greatest organizing tool we could have ever asked for. I was silent, listening. Listening, she continued, her voice gaining intensity. He wanted to make an example of you, to scare everyone else into line, but he miscalculated. Wade, he didn't make you an example. He made you a martyr. And we're going to build a campaign around that. We're going to organize that plant, and we're going to get you justice. Martyr. The word struck me like a jolt from a live wire. It reframed everything. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't redundant. I was a symbol. I was the fuse that was about to light the whole damn powder keg. I looked around my garage at the tools hanging neatly on the pegboard, at the solid, honest steel of the motorcycle frame. This was my world. A world of things that were real, things you could build and fix. Ralph and his kind, they didn't build anything, they just extracted. They were parasites, and it was time to burn the parasite out. Okay, Maria, I said, my voice steady and clear, what's the first step? The first step was a meeting, not in some fancy union hall or a sterile office, but in a place that felt more like my world, a booth at a 24-hour diner called the Crossroads, halfway between my town and the state capital. The place smelled of stale coffee, bacon grease, and quiet desperation. It was the perfect place to plan a revolution. Maria Flores was not what I had expected. I'd pictured some old grizzled union boss, a guy who looked like he'd been in a few picket line brawls. But Maria was maybe 40, sharp and energetic, with eyes that seemed to see right through you. She had a laptop open on the table, but she didn't look at it once while we talked. Her focus was entirely on me. She ordered black coffee, same as me. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slid a pen and a napkin across the Formica tabletop. I want you to write down everything, she said. Every detail of the meeting with Ralph. What he said, what you said. The names of anyone else in the room. The exact time. Everything you can remember. So I told her. I recounted the whole pathetic spectacle, the buzzword salad, the veiled threats, the final cold dismissal. As I talked, she nodded, her expression grim but unsurprised. When I finished, she took the napkin and folded it carefully, placing it in her bag. That's good, she said. That's a clear violation of the National Labor Relations Act, Section 8A3. Retaliation for union activity. It's the cornerstone of our ULP charge. ULP, Unfair Labor Practice. It was the first of many acronyms I would learn. But the legal side, she explained, leaning forward, that's just the skeleton. It gives us structure, a backbone. The real fight, Wade, is for the hearts and minds of the guys on that floor. The law can take months, years. An organizing campaign moves as fast as people are willing to move, and for that we need more than a legal case. We need a story, your story. She was right. The guys on the floor didn't know about Section 8A3, but they knew me. They knew my 25 years. They knew I was a straight shooter. My illegal firing wasn't an abstract legal concept. It was a personal betrayal. They all understood. But how do we reach them? I asked. Ralph will have that place on lockdown. He'll have security watching everyone. Maria smiled, a real smile this time, and it was like a light coming on. We don't go through the front door, she said. We go around. We build a network, an underground railroad of information. We need people on the inside, people you trust. Who's your guy, Wade? Everyone has one, the guy you'd trust with your life. The name came to my lips instantly. Sully. Sullivan O'Malley. He'd been head of maintenance for the last 15 years. I'd trained him myself when he was just a kid, fresh out of trade school. He was a wizard with machines, a grumpy, cynical Irishman who hated management on principle. But he was loyal to the bone to the people he respected, and he hated Ralph with a passion that was almost religious. Good, Maria said. Call him, set up a meeting, somewhere quiet. No phones, or at least turn them off and take the batteries out if you can. From now on, we operate on the assumption that we're being watched and listened to. The next morning, I drove out to Miller's Pond, a fishing spot where Sully and I used to go when we had a particularly bad week. I found him there, sitting on an overturned bucket, his fishing line still in the water. He hadn't even baited the hook, he was just staring at the water. He heard my truck but didn't turn around. I heard what that son of a bitch did, he said, his voice a low growl. I almost walked out yesterday, Wade. I swear to God, the only thing that stopped me was I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I sat down on the grass beside him. I need your help, Sully. He finally looked at me, his weathered face etched with anger. Anything. You name it. I laid out the plan Maria and I had discussed, the organizing drive, the need for information. I needed to know what was happening inside the plant, what Ralph was saying, how the men were reacting. I needed to be able to counter the company's propaganda with real-time facts. I was asking him to be a spy, to put his own job on the line. He didn't hesitate for a second. He spat on the ground. It'll be a pleasure. That arrogant prick has been running this place into the ground since the day he arrived. He thinks we're all idiots who don't see what he's doing. It's about time someone showed him what a real idiot looks like. That was the beginning of our secret plan. Sully became my nerve center on the inside. And my main weapon, my hidden leverage, was something Ralph could never have anticipated. It wasn't some piece of secret code or a proprietary process. It was my own meticulous, obsessive nature. It was my little black notebook. When I got home from meeting Sully, I retrieved the notebook from my lunchbox. I sat down at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and began to go through it, page by page. For years I had documented everything, not out of malice, but because it was my job to ensure things ran smoothly and safely. It was a supervisor's log, but reading it now in the context of what had happened, it was a damning indictment of Ralph's entire tenure as general manager. Date March 12th, time 2:15 p.m. Topic hydraulic seals, press tank 3. Present Wade Miller, Sullivan O'Malley, Ralph Kowalski. Summary: Sully and I presented data showing seals are at 150% of their recommended service life, recommended immediate replacement, cost $850. Ralph's decision, the operational cost per unit metric doesn't support a replacement until Q4. I had his exact moronic words written down. Date April 5th, time 9 a.m., topic monthly safety meeting. Ralph canceled it, reason given, need to meet production quota for the Acme Auto contract. This was the third month in a row. Date May 21st. Topic forklift maintenance. The brakes on forklift 7 were spongy. Sully requisitioned new brake pads. Ralph denied the request. Ordered the maintenance team to just bleed the lines instead. A cheaper temporary fix. A week later, that same forklift bumped a pallet of finished parts, causing $10,000 in damage. The incident report, which I had a copy of, blamed operator error. It was all there. A meticulous, dated, undeniable record of incompetence, negligence, and greed. This notebook was the truth. It was the ammunition we would use to arm the workers against the lies Ralph was about to start telling them. The campaign began slowly, quietly. Maria was a master strategist. We started by building an organizing committee, a small group of the most respected workers from every department. We met in secret, in people's garages, in the back room of a VFW hall, in the basement of a church. I'd start the meetings by telling my story, just the plain, unvarnished truth. And then I'd open my notebook. I'd say, remember back in June when the main coolant line on the big lathe ruptured. Remember how the whole north end of the floor was flooded and we lost a full day of production. The company line was that it was an unforeseeable accident. But here, on April 10th, is my entry about warning Ralph that the line's pressure fittings were showing signs of metal fatigue. He said, and I quote, "We'll put it on the list for the scheduled summer shutdown." He rolled the dice with our safety and our jobs to avoid a few hours of preventative maintenance. The men would listen, their faces hardening. These weren't abstract stories. They had lived them. They had seen the near misses. They had worked with the faulty equipment. My notebook just connected the dots, drawing a straight line from their daily frustrations to the decisions being made in Ralph's quiet, air-conditioned office. Sully was our secret weapon. He'd feed me information daily. Ralph was holding a meeting with the welders. Sully would text me what was being said. Ralph was promising a new bonus structure. Sully would send me a picture of the internal memo detailing how the bonus was actually impossible to achieve. We were always one step ahead. The company fought back, of course. Ralph posted flyers with cartoons of fat, cigar-chomping union bosses. He held captive audience meetings where he'd talk about how a union would just create a wall between the workers and management. He even brought in a union-busting consultant, a slick guy in an expensive suit who talked about how we were all one big family. In one of those meetings, the consultant was going on about his open-door policy. And Frank, the welder, a big quiet guy who was on our committee, raised his hand. He stood up, all 6'4" of him, and he asked, in his slow, deliberate way, "That's real interesting. But I was wondering, if the door is so open, why didn't Ralph listen to Wade and Sully when they told him those bearings on press 3 were going to fail? My cousin works in the tool and die shop. He said it was a miracle someone didn't get killed when that thing finally seized up last month." The consultant's face went pale. Ralph, who was standing at the back of the room, turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before. The room was dead silent. The men were looking at Frank, then at Ralph. The company's narrative had been shattered by a single simple question, armed with the truth from my notebook. We weren't just whispering anymore, we were starting to roar. For weeks we worked in the shadows, collecting union authorization cards one by one. It was a slow, painstaking process. A conversation in a parking lot, a card signed on the hood of a car, a hushed meeting over a beer after a long shift. We needed to get signatures from at least 30% of the workers just to file for an election. Maria told us to aim for 65%. She said the company will always find ways to challenge names to disqualify people. We needed an overwhelming, undeniable majority. The day we crossed the 70% threshold felt like a victory in itself. Maria held up the stack of signed cards in the church basement where we were meeting. She had a fierce, proud look on her face. "This is it," she said. "This is our mandate. Tomorrow we file the petition. Tomorrow we take the fight out of the shadows and into the light." The day Maria filed the petition for a union election with the National Labor Relations Board was the day the Cold War at Precision Dynamics turned hot. The official NLRB notice, a dry bureaucratic document, was posted on the bulletin board next to the time clock. To most people it was just a piece of paper. To the workers at the plant it was a declaration of independence. Ralph's reaction was exactly what we had anticipated, pure, unadulterated panic. He had genuinely believed that firing me had solved his problem. He saw the workers as sheep, and he had removed the shepherd. He couldn't comprehend that the sheep had learned to organize themselves. His arrogance had blinded him to the rage and resentment that had been simmering on his factory floor for months. His first move was to double down on the union-busting consultants. They swarmed the plant, a plague of smiling, well-dressed locusts all armed with iPads and PowerPoint presentations. The captive audience meetings became a daily occurrence. They showed us slickly produced videos about strikes and plant closures, always careful to mention they were at other companies, of course. They told us stories of union corruption, of fat cat bosses living high on the hog off the members' dues. They passed out pamphlets with complicated charts showing how much money we would lose to dues every year. But Maria and our committee had prepped everyone for this. We had already held our own meetings explaining exactly how dues worked, where the money went. We had our own pamphlets, simple, one-page documents that showed how much our wages had stagnated compared to the company's profits. We had an answer for every one of their lies. The real turning point came from Sully. Ralph, in a desperate attempt to look like a benevolent leader, started making what he called shop floor tours. He'd walk around with a clipboard and a fake smile, asking workers for their suggestions. It was a pathetic, transparent charade, but the men, coached by our committee, played along beautifully. An older guy named George, who worked in shipping, flagged Ralph down. He said, "Mr. Kowalski, I'm glad you're doing this. We've been having a real problem with the loading dock door. It keeps jamming, and it's a real safety hazard." Ralph made a great show of writing it down on his clipboard. "Thank you, George. I'll look right into that. We take safety very seriously here." What Ralph didn't know was that George had a copy of the maintenance request he'd filed for that same door 6 months earlier. A request that Ralph himself had denied, with a handwritten note on the bottom that said, "Not in the current quarter's budget." That evening we put out a simple flyer. We didn't even put the union logo on it. It just had a picture of the jammed loading dock door on one side. On the other, it had a copy of George's original work order and Ralph's denial, next to a photo of Ralph from the company newsletter with the quote, "We take safety very seriously here." We papered the employee parking lot with them. The next day, the atmosphere in the plant had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a kind of defiant mockery. Someone had taped one of our flyers to the broken loading dock door. Someone else had written "Not in the budget" on the dusty window of Ralph's office. He was no longer a feared tyrant. He was a joke. His panic escalated. He began to make mistakes. He started pulling individual workers into his office for one-on-one chats. These were thinly veiled interrogation sessions. He'd ask them if they'd signed a union card, who they'd been talking to, what promises the union had made. This was not only illegal, it was stupid. It created more evidence for our ULP charges. Sully's people were ready. A young machinist named Kyle went into one of these meetings with his phone in his shirt pocket, recording audio. We got a crystal clear recording of Ralph threatening him, telling him that if the union came in, the company would have to reconsider its investment in this facility. It was a textbook threat of a plant closure, one of the most serious violations of labor law. Maria could barely contain her excitement when I played the recording for her. "This is the silver bullet," she said. "This man is a walking, talking liability. He's not just going to lose this election for the company. He's going to get himself fired." The day of the election was tense. The NLRB set up polling booths in the employee cafeteria. The consultants stood near the entrance, their smiles looking more like pained grimaces. Ralph was nowhere to be seen, holed up in his office like a besieged dictator in his bunker. I wasn't allowed on company property, so I waited with Maria in our usual booth at the Crossroads Diner. We drank coffee and made small talk, but neither of us could really focus. The future of hundreds of people, the culmination of months of secret meetings and risky conversations, was being decided, one secret ballot at a time. My entire life had led to this moment, to this dingy diner booth, waiting for a phone call. The polls closed at 5. The vote counting began. Every minute that ticked by felt like an hour. I stared out the window, watching the traffic go by, my leg bouncing uncontrollably under the table. At 6:17 p.m., Maria's phone rang. She answered it, her face a mask of professional calm. She just listened, nodding. "Uh-huh, okay. And the challenge ballots? I see. Got it. Thank you." She hung up the phone and placed it carefully on the table. She took a slow sip of her cold coffee. Then she looked at me, and a huge, brilliant smile spread across her face. "It wasn't even close, Wade. 212 to 43. 212 to 43, the numbers washed over me, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees. We had won. We had done the impossible. The sheep had grown teeth. But the real power shift wasn't just in the numbers. It began the very next morning, before a single negotiation session had been scheduled. The first tremor was an email that landed in my inbox at 7:05 a.m. It was from Sully. The subject line was just one word: done. Attached was a copy of his letter of resignation. He gave them 2 weeks' notice, but his message was clear. He was no longer willing to work for a man like Ralph, union or no union. He wasn't the only one. By midday, I had heard from 2 of the senior CNC machinists, men I had personally mentored, the best in the plant. They had walked into HR together and quit. They didn't have other jobs lined up. They just had their pride. They were a part of what I started to call the precision exodus. It wasn't a flood of people leaving. It was a strategic drain of the most critical, irreplaceable talent. The guys who held decades of knowledge in their heads, the kind of knowledge you can't just teach someone from a manual. The company could replace their bodies, but they couldn't replace their expertise. I remembered a phrase Mr. Henderson used to use: competence isn't cheap until you lose it. Precision Dynamics was about to find out just how expensive that loss could be. The final desperate act came 2 days later. My phone rang and I saw Ralph's name on the caller ID. I almost didn't answer, but I was curious. I wanted to hear it. I let it ring a few times, then picked up. "Wade," his voice said. It was completely different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a thin, reedy tone of desperation. "Ralph," I said, my voice flat. "Listen, Wade, we got off on the wrong foot. There were misunderstandings. I was under a lot of pressure from corporate." I said nothing. I just let the silence hang there, let him stew in it. "I want to make this right," he stammered. "I've been thinking. That supervisor role. It was beneath you. We have a plant operations manager position opening up. It's yours, a 30% raise. We can make this all go away. Just tell your union friends to stand down. Call off the dogs. We can fix this, you and me." Call off the dogs, the same condescending language even in his desperation. He still didn't get it. He thought this was about me, about one man's grudge. He couldn't see the larger truth. This was never just about me. It was about all of us. I let him finish his pathetic rambling offer. When he was done, the silence stretched for a long moment. Then I said calmly and clearly, "The time for that is over, Ralph. My dogs, as you call them, are the workers you threatened and disrespected. They have a voice now, and our first negotiation session is tomorrow at 9 a.m. You'll hear their voice then. Be ready." I hung up the phone before he could reply. The game was over. All that was left was the checkmate. The conference room at Precision Dynamics felt like a neutral territory, a sterile box that belonged to no one. On one side of the long, polished table sat Ralph, flanked by a slick, silver-haired lawyer from a big corporate firm and a shell-shocked HR director who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. They looked pale and exhausted, like a trio who had been up all night arguing. Ralph wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a blank notepad in front of him, his face a grim mask. On our side of the table, we were a portrait of the new reality. There was Maria, the professional, with her binders and her calm, unwavering confidence. Next to her was Frank, the giant welder, his huge, calloused hands resting on the table, a silent, intimidating presence. Next to him was a young woman named Rosa from the packaging department, sharp and fearless, representing the newer generation of workers. And then there was me. My presence at the table was, in itself, a masterstroke by Maria. I was not an employee. I had no official standing. But the newly formed Local 11742 of the International Association of Machinists had voted to retain me as a special consultant to the negotiating committee. It was a perfectly legal move and a deeply symbolic one. The man Ralph had tried to erase was sitting directly across from him, an equal at the table where the future of the plant would be decided. Maria opened the proceedings. Her tone was formal, all business. "Good morning. We're here today to begin negotiations for a first contract between Precision Dynamics and the members of IM Local 1742. We have a number of proposals to discuss, covering wages, benefits, and working conditions." The corporate lawyer nodded, preparing to launch into what I was sure was a well-rehearsed speech about partnership and finding common ground, but Maria didn't give him the chance. However, she continued, her voice cutting through the stale air, "Before we can begin to discuss any economic proposals, there is a foundational issue of trust and legality that must be addressed. We have one non-negotiable proposal that must be resolved before we can proceed." She reached into her binder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the polished surface of the table. It stopped directly in front of Ralph. He stared at it for a moment as if it were a venomous snake. Then, slowly, he picked it up. Frank, Rosa, and I watched him, silent. We knew what it said. We had all drafted it together in the church basement 2 nights before. It was proposal num 1. It contained a single sentence. The immediate and unconditional termination for cause of General Manager Ralph Kowalski based on his documented, repeated, and illegal union-busting activities which have exposed Precision Dynamics to significant legal, financial, and operational liability. The color drained from Ralph's face. He read the sentence, then read it again, his lips moving silently. A dark, ugly red began to creep up his neck, a rising tide of fury and humiliation. He slammed the paper down on the table. This is outrageous, he sputtered, his voice cracking. You have no right. This is a joke. The corporate lawyer, seeing his client about to completely self-destruct, put a restraining hand on Ralph's arm. Now let's be reasonable, he said in a placating tone. Management rights are a core principle. You can't dictate who the company employs in a management position. That's a non-starter. Maria didn't even flinch. She simply reached into her briefcase and pulled out another binder. It was a thick 5-inch D-ring binder filled to capacity. She placed it on the table with a heavy, definitive thud. The sound echoed in the silent room. This, she said, her voice dropping to a low, cold level, is not a negotiation tactic. This is a choice we are offering you. This binder contains the evidence for the 6 separate unfair labor practice charges we have filed with the National Labor Relations Board. It contains sworn and notarized affidavits from 27 of your employees. It contains copies of your own internal emails and memos. It contains a full unedited audio recording of you threatening an employee with a plant closure if the union was successful. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The lawyer's eyes were wide, fixed on the binder as if it were a bomb. We can go the legal route, she continued. We can spend the next 2 years in litigation. The NLRB will order you to turn over every piece of internal communication. Your executives will be subpoenaed. It will cost your company hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in legal fees. And at the end of that process, when we win, and with this evidence we will win, the board will likely order not only your termination but significant back pay for Wade, a formal admission of guilt to be posted throughout the plant, and a host of other remedies that will be both expensive and deeply humiliating for this company's reputation. She leaned forward slightly. Or you can accept proposal number 1 right now. You can cut the cancer out and we can begin the actual work of building a productive and legal partnership that will secure the future of this plant. The choice is yours, but it's a choice you will make today. The lawyer looked at the binder. He looked at the furious, sputtering face of his client. He looked at the calm, determined faces on our side of the table. He was a man who understood leverage, and he knew in that moment that he had none. The game was over. Ralph was a massive, smoking liability, and the first rule of corporate law is to cut your losses. I hadn't said a word. I just sat there and watched. I finally looked at Ralph, meeting his eyes across the table. All the fight, all the bluster had drained out of him. He looked small and pathetic in his expensive, squeaking chair. In his eyes, I didn't see hatred anymore. I saw fear, and I saw something else, the dawning, horrifying realization that he had been completely and utterly outplayed. He thought he was a chess master, but he had been playing checkers, and he had just been triple jumped. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of vindication, a sense of a great weight being lifted. The world felt like it had finally spun back onto its proper axis. He had tried to break me. He had tried to silence all of us. But all he had done was make us stronger. He had taught us that power isn't something that's given to you from on high. It's something you build from the ground up together. That was the end of it. The lawyer asked for a brief caucus. He and the HR director took Ralph into a separate room. We didn't hear any shouting. 10 minutes later, they came back in. Ralph was gone. The lawyer sat down, adjusted his tie, and looked at Maria. He slid proposal none back across the table. Okay, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. Let's talk about wages. They fired Ralph that afternoon. He was escorted from the premises by security, carrying his own little cardboard box. I wasn't there to see it, but Sully called me and described it in gleeful, loving detail. The company brought in an interim general manager from their head office, an older guy on the verge of retirement who had actually worked his way up from a factory floor a long time ago. He was quiet, he listened, and he treated people with a basic level of respect. The negotiations were still tough, they always are, but they were fair. We didn't get everything we wanted, but we got a solid first contract. We got fair wage increases, better benefits, and most importantly, we got a voice. We established a joint health and safety committee with real power to stop the line if they saw a hazard. We put an end to the impossible quotas. We brought dignity back to the work. I never went back to my old job. I didn't want it. The union, funded by the national office, offered me a full-time position as a new organizer. My job now is to travel to other plants, to other towns, and find other groups of workers who are being squeezed by their own versions of Ralph Kowalski. I tell them my story. I show them that it's possible to fight back and win. I help them find their own voice. A few months after the contract was signed, I was out in my garage. The shovel head was finally finished. Every piece of chrome gleamed under the overhead lights. The engine, rebuilt by my own hands, was a thing of mechanical beauty. My son Jake came out and stood there for a minute just looking at it. He'd been different since it all went down. Quieter, more thoughtful. The disappointment I'd seen on his face that first day had been replaced by a new kind of respect. So he said, running a hand over the freshly painted fuel tank, "You're like a professional revolutionary now or something." I laughed, a real deep laugh that came from my gut. "Something like that," I said. "I just help people remember that their work has value, that they have value, and that no one can take that away from them unless they let them." I threw a leg over the bike and fired it up. The engine roared to life, a deep, rumbling thunder that shook the whole garage. It was the sound of power, real power, the kind you build yourself. I looked at Jake. "You want to go for a ride?" A huge grin spread across his face. "Now I'm talking to you. What Ralph and the people at Northwood Capital never understood is a simple, fundamental truth. A company isn't a building, or a brand, or the number on a stock ticker. It's people. It's the collective skill in their hands, the shared knowledge in their heads, and the quiet dignity in their hearts. They think they can strip mine that resource, that they can squeeze it until it's dry and then just move on to the next one. They think loyalty is a one-way street and respect is something they are owed by virtue of their job title. They are wrong. They are wrong. Arrogance has a price tag, and sooner or later the bill always comes due. They thought they were making an example of me, but all they did was provide a spark. They wanted to get rid of one troublemaker, but instead they created an army. That's a lesson that a lot of people in shiny new offices need to learn. Competence isn't cheap, but it's nothing compared to the cost of losing it all. And a person's dignity, that's priceless, and it's worth fighting for. What do you think? Have you ever had a boss who was so arrogant they couldn't see the disaster they were creating? Let me know your story in the comments below. I promise you I read every single one. And if you believe that the little guy deserves to win and you want to hear more stories about karmic justice in the workplace, do me a favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to see that fighting back is possible, and make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.